Hey there, this is Mr. Icarus, and welcome to yet another edition of Doom Mod Madness. This time round, we are checking out Brutal Doom 64. Pretty hot off the press is this one, only recently been unleashed upon the world. It made its debut on Halloween, that's Halloween 2016 for all of you watching this video from the future, and it is of course Brutal Doom for Doom 64. Now I have to stress this isn't the first port of Doom 64 to make its way on the PC. We've of course got other versions like Doom 64 EX, and from what I've been told that's a much more faithful recreation of Doom 64. This is of course something that takes a few more liberties, but I'm probably going to be a little unaware of most of those liberties because quite frankly, I'm not all that familiar with Doom 64. In my defense though, I was a PlayStation kid. It was my friends that owned the N64s, and even then, it was pretty tricky to come across one of them that actually owned a copy of Doom 64 itself. But anyway, enough reminiscing. We're here to talk about Brutal Doom 64 and figure out what exactly it brings to the table. I did watch a few playthroughs of the original Doom 64 as preparation for this, so I could maybe identify the differences a bit better, but one of the things that seems to have been maintained from the original version into this version of Doom 64 is that it's still pretty damn creepy. And I feel like a lot of that creepiness can be attributed to the soundtrack that's being used here. This is something very different from what you'd normally expect out of, say, Doom 1 or Doom 2 with the original MIDI soundtracks. This is something on a little bit of a different level. There's a lot of ambient sound here, stuff that's pretty subtle in terms of sound work that does genuinely get under your skin every now and again, and really does help to amp up the atmosphere of the levels that you'll be traveling through. But in terms of what Brutal Doom 64 itself does to help maintain this atmosphere, I guess you could definitely point to the use of visual and lighting effects. In fact, I dare say that some of this helps intensify the creepy atmosphere of Doom 64. You've got bits of extra fog and mist drifting around certain levels. The lighting effects are certainly very fancy looking. However, you could also make the argument that enhanced visual effects like these are also a little bit of a double-edged sword, especially when you compare them against the original Doom 64 or even Doom 64 EX, because in my opinion those had a bit more visual clarity, whereas this one just occasionally gets very murky, very dark, and sometimes requires a fair bit of squinting. And it may just be personal preference, but I don't feel that really contributes all that much. You can still have atmosphere, but still be able to see what's going on in certain areas. But even then, it's a relatively minor issue. I mean, the most frustration I got out of it was in relation to switches, because, first of all, they're not really all that distinct from the surrounding environment in the first place. And when you add fog, when you add visual effects, when you add blood splatter and gore on top of that, it can be really tricky to spot them, especially if you're not familiar with the level itself in the first place. Speaking of blood splatter and gore, it's still very much present and accounted for here in Brutal Doom 64. Personally, I like to dial the gore options up to overdrawn at a blood bank level, because that's just how I roll, but it may not be the same level of gore you'd normally expect, especially if you're a fan of regular Brutal Doom, especially the more recent versions of it. There's not much location-based damage here, or weapon-specific animations on enemies when you riddle them full of holes, but still, they fly apart rather nicely when you get them in the face with a super shotgun. They fly apart nicely when you blast them with a rocket launcher. Oh, and this is new. This is something that I'm pretty sure wasn't in the original version. We've got text logs. And these clue you into one of the other additions that Brutal Doom 64 has in it, which are Revenants. Now, I believe this was also a feature of Doom 64 EX, but it didn't have the reskinned variants that Brutal Doom 64 has. These versions seem to fit a lot more into the aesthetic of Brutal Doom 64 itself. Personally, though, I'm not a real massive fan of the way the enemies actually look in the N64 version of Doom. I feel like they're just a little too plasticky. They look more like posable models than anything else, and yeah, I've just got much more of a soft spot for those original Doom sprites. But some of the decisions they made for certain enemies in the N64 version, I just couldn't quite understand. Hopefully soon we'll come across a cacodemon, and you'll just think, why? Why did they decide a cacodemon should look like that? There was absolutely nothing wrong with the original version. As far as I can tell, the vast majority of the maps here are largely unchanged from the original versions in Doom 64, which is a pretty good decision in my opinion, because when you think about it, the vast majority of people out there won't have actually had hands-on experience with Doom 64, myself included. For a lot of people out there, this will be their very first taste of what Doom 64 has to offer, and preserving that experience as best it can is definitely in Brutal Doom 64's favor. Obviously, there's going to be some quality of life improvements around the place. I noticed that the video screens that show you the effect of certain switches have been made a hell of a lot more obvious, but that is definitely stuff that helps the player out and makes things a little bit more clear. That said though, the vid screens are a little bit of a crutch that you can't really rely on later on down the line, especially in levels like this one where they just quite frankly don't exist anymore. You don't get that instant feedback of flipping a switch and knowing what it changed or what it opened, and as a result, a lot of the levels kind of fall into what I like to call the head scratcher category. Ones that don't really have as much straightforward logic as you'd like when it comes to switch flippery, and you'll just spend a lot of time running around in circles and getting a little bit annoyed with yourself in terms of not knowing where to go next. In terms of the weaponry you'll be able to get your hands on here, it's pretty much standard fare for the most part. All the usual suspects are here. Some nifty reskins. The rocket launcher's looking pretty nice there, as does the plasma gun, but the real oddity here is this one. This is the Unmaker. This is something that you could only get in Doom 64, and it's pretty much a demonic laser gun. When it comes to lower level enemies like imps or zombies, all it takes is one bolt from this thing to make them go splat. But the real interesting thing about the Unmaker is that it can be upgraded, and you do that through acquiring demon keys. Unfortunately, that's something that I didn't manage to do during my initial run of this, but it's still a very interesting addition, and something that I believe was also in the original Doom Bible, that original design document, but for some reason it just never made it into the regular versions. It only made its appearance here in Doom 64, but now, thankfully, with the advent of Doom 64 EX and Brutal Doom 64, everyone else can get their hands on it and see what the fuss is about. Actually, while I'm at it, another thing that I found quite interesting about this weapon is just the noise that it makes when you're holding it, when it's active. It makes these really eerie, creepy sounds, and I can't be sure whether that was a feature of the original Doom 64 or whether that's something that was added in for Brutal Doom 64, but either way, it makes you feel kind of wrong for even holding the thing, which I suppose is kind of appropriate for a demonic pew-pew laser weapon. One that is probably made out of flesh and bone. Earlier on I mentioned that the Revenant wasn't originally part of Doom 64, and that was largely down to the fact that there just wasn't enough memory on the N64 cartridge, but believe it or not, the Spider Mastermind was never originally part of Doom 64 either. This is something that has been reintroduced for Brutal Doom 64, and I have to admit, they look pretty damn badass, they look pretty damn intimidating, and you'll actually come across these multiple times during the course of your campaign. In fact, this actually causes me to wonder what enemies these replace, because I'm not entirely sure. It could be the Mancubus, could be something else, but either way, it's a good excuse for me to go back and check out the original Doom 64 version of the campaign, see what it's like unvarnished, without all the bells and whistles on top. And speaking of bells and whistles, there's actually another enemy that's not native to Doom 64 in here, and that's the Hellhound, which is a two-headed angry red dog that I think barfs fireballs at you, so you'll occasionally run into that as well. But when it comes down to this, when it comes down to the Cyber Demon, I can't help but just prefer the original version. There's just something about this style that makes it feel a lot less intimidating and less of a trial, less of an ordeal. But ultimately, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about Brutal Doom 64. I did kind of go into this expecting something similar to the more recent Brutal Doom entry, something a little bit more bombastic, but instead I got something that was actually trying to be a little bit more faithful to Doom 64, something that was trying to preserve that original atmosphere while also adding fancy lighting effects and buckets of blood and guts. I suppose what I'm trying to say here is your enjoyment of Brutal Doom 64 will pretty much come down to how much you take to the Doom 64 side of Brutal Doom 64, how much you take to its style and its level design and its atmosphere, because ultimately at this stage, the Brutal Doom side of it doesn't really change anything too drastically. As for the future though, well, that's entirely up to Sergeant Mark IV and his plans for Brutal Doom 64. I can pretty much guarantee that the next update for this will include heads that explode when you shoot them, so that's one step closer to the Brutal Doom everyone may recognize, but yeah, it'll be interesting to revisit this. Give it 6 months, come back to it much later down the line and maybe see how much things have changed, but as of right now, it's a pretty interesting way to experience Doom 64. And if you'd like to do that, the link is of course in the description below. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments, and feel free to suggest any mods you'd like to see me cover in future episodes of Doom Mod Madness. This has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.